The first light of dawn stretched gently across the hills of Delphi, painting the sky with soft lavender and gold. The mist still clung to the olive trees that blanketed the lower slopes, their silvery leaves whispering in the early breeze, in the quiet that only morning knows, before the first footsteps echoed through the stone-paved alleys. A single window in the village stirred with faint movement. It was the home of Damon, the potter. His home was modest, built from sun-dried clay bricks and wood beams, its walls the color of honey and dust. Vines of ivy climbed one side, where the morning sun would warm them just enough to tempt the lizards from their hiding. The tiled roof bore signs of age, not broken, but weathered, as if it too had seen many days and learned to live with the quiet weight of time. Inside, the room was still. In the center sat a potter's wheel, low to the ground, well used, its surface darkened by years of clay and water. Shelves lined the walls, cradling rows of bowls, amphorae, jugs, and dishes in various stages of drying or finishing. Some were simple, meant for oil or wine. Others were adorned with gentle carvings of vines, birds, or mythic creatures, their shapes formed slowly, patiently, by Damon's own hands. Damon himself stirred from sleep as the village roosters called to each other in distant corners. He sat up slowly, not out of reluctance, but out of ritual. Every movement he made in the morning was thoughtful, purposeful. There was no rush in his life, only rhythm. He stood, wrapped a plain woolen hamation over his shoulders, and stepped into his sandals. He began his morning the same way he always had, with water. From the clay jar near the door, he poured cool, clear water into a shallow basin. He washed his face, hands, and arms, letting the droplets fall to the stone floor. Outside, a bird sang its first note, high, bright, uncertain, as if testing the day ahead. Damon looked toward the sound, smiled faintly, and moved to light the hearth. As the flames caught, he warmed a piece of bread, left over from yesterday, and spread a little fig paste upon it. The taste was sweet and soft, grounding him in the familiar. He ate in silence, sitting on a low stool by the window, watching as the mist lifted from the valley and revealed the sacred path, winding toward the temple of Apollo. The village had not yet awakened, but the land was alive. Far off, a shepherd's dog barked twice, then fell quiet again. A breeze swept in from the mountains, carrying with it the scent of pine and wild thyme. Damon breathed it in deeply. He was not young, but not old either, in the middle of his life, where strength and calm begin to balance one another. His hands bore calluses, his back carried a slight stoop, but his eyes were clear and soft, eyes that had seen many pots shaped, many kilns fired, many seasons turn. Today, like every day, he would work with clay. He walked slowly to the shelves, selecting a half-dried bowl from the top. Its shape pleased him, rounded, symmetrical, solid. He set it on the bench and examined the curve with his fingers, running his thumb along the edge. There was a small imperfection near the base, not a flaw, but a fingerprint left too long. Rather than scrape it away, he smiled and left it. It was part of the bowl's story. Damon's workshop opened onto a small courtyard where a pomegranate tree leaned gracefully over the wall. The kiln stood there, squat and sturdy, its mouth blackened with age. A few broken shards from old firings lay near its base, relics of past lessons and quiet failures. He brushed them aside, not in disdain, but with a sense of quiet respect. Every broken piece had taught him something. He placed the bowl on a flat board, added to more pieces he had finished yesterday, and carried them out to sit under the tree. The sun had begun to warm the courtyard stones, and the scent of the blossoms had intensified. Damon sat on a stool, set his wheel in motion, and began to shape a new vessel. His hands were steady as they pressed the clay upward, fingers guiding the spinning earth into form. Water trickled from a jug beside him, keeping the clay supple. As he worked, time seemed to fall away. The wheel turned, the clay rose, the breeze moved across his skin. Birds called above, bees hummed lazily round the pomegranate flowers, and the world, for a moment, felt perfectly still, not silent, but still in the way that brings peace to the heart. The shape formed slowly, a tall, narrow-necked vase. Damon leaned closer, eyes narrowed slightly, smoothing the neck with careful strokes. He carved a gentle pattern into the body, a series of interlocking waves, reminiscent of the spring he used to visit as a child, where minnows darted beneath. The rocks, it was a memory in clay, and it settled onto the vase with grace. As the sun climbed higher, the village began to stir. Footsteps passed on the path beyond his gate. A woman laughed gently. Children's voices rang out as they chased each other past the temple steps. The sense of morning bread and lavender rose in the air. But Damon remained in his courtyard, hands coated in clay, working slowly, rhythmically, quietly. He did not need more than this. His life was not grand, not filled with wealth or renown, but it was full of stillness, of soft mornings, of creation, of breath, in shaping the earth. He found his place within it. The potter of Delphi was not a figure of legend. He was not inscribed in stone, but in the soft hum of his wheel and the curves of his vessels. He lived a life that flowed like water, gentle and lasting, a quiet life, shaped by hand and by heart. The sun moved higher above the mountains, filtering light through the courtyard's olive branches, casting soft, trembling shadows on the stone. Damon set the finished vase onto the drying shelf, gently turning it so the carved pattern faced the morning light. The clay would need time, just like everything else in his world. Rushing only invited cracks, warps, or worse. Time was not something to conquer here. It was something to walk beside. A pair of sparrows hopped along the outer ledge, peering curiously into the courtyard. One of them fluttered briefly toward the workshop, then darted away again, startled. By the creak of Damon's stool, he turned his head slowly, watching their wings flicker like scraps of brown cloth in the air. He liked the company of birds. They never stayed long, but they always returned by late morning. The warmth in the courtyard was growing. Damon took a small clay cup, filled it with spring water, and sipped slowly. The taste was earthy, clean, and cold from the deep stone basin where it had rested. He walked back inside the workshop, wiping his hands on a linen cloth that had known many years of service. Inside, the shelves waited patiently. Rows of unfired bowls, cups, and plates stood, like quiet sentinels, their surfaces smooth and gray with moisture. Some would be painted later, with swirling lines or small scenes of animals and vines. Others would remain plain. He believed that not all beauty required embellishment. Sometimes, it was the shape itself that spoke. As he worked, there came a soft knock at the wooden door, not hurried, but polite, like a stone tapping gently against another. Damon rose slowly and crossed the room. When he opened the door, he found Nicodemus, the baker's son, standing with a wrapped bundle under his arm. "Good day, Damon," the boy said shyly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "And good day to you, Nicodemus," Damon replied, stepping aside. "Come in. What brings you?" The boy entered, his eyes scanning the shelves with the same wonder he always brought. Mother sent bread, still warm. Damon took the bundle with a grateful nod, then walked to the bench and unwrapped it. Inside was a round loaf with a golden crust, faintly dusted with ash from the baker's oven. The scent was rich and comforting. "Thank her for me," Damon said, slicing off a piece and offering it to the boy. Nicodemus hesitated, then took it with both hands. They sat together for a few quiet moments, chewing, not speaking. The boy looked around at the vessels again, then pointed to one. "Did you make that today?" "Yes," Damon said, following his gaze. "It's a storage jar. For olives, perhaps, or oil." The boy nodded, then looked at his hands. "Could you teach me someday?" Damon smiled, not surprised. Nicodemus had asked before, and he would likely ask again. There was something in the stillness of the wheel that called to certain souls, those who found peace in the shaping of earth. "Come on the next rest day," Damon said softly. "We'll begin with the basics. First, how to prepare the clay." Nicodemus's eyes lit up, but he didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. His silence held more meaning than words. He finished his bread, gave a respectful bow, and left, his sandals tapping lightly down the lane. Damon stood alone again in the workshop, but he was smiling. He remembered when he had first placed his hands in clay, under the guidance of Anne. Uncle long past. That memory was not faded. It lived in every vessel he made. As the day unfolded, Damon returned to his work. He kneaded fresh clay on the slab, working it slowly, folding it over itself like bread dough. The cool, wet earth yielded under his palms, becoming soft, smooth, pliable. Each batch needed care. Any air trapped inside could ruin it in the kiln. He pressed gently, patiently, the same way he'd been taught as a boy outside. The village now moved in full rhythm. Merchants passed by the lower path toward the temple, carrying bolts of fabric, amphorae of wine, and woven baskets of herbs. A pair of goats bleated in the distance, being led by a girl no older than Nicodemus. The temple bell rang once, a reminder of noon. But none of that pulled Damon from his focus. The noise of the world came to him like the wind, faint, natural, and distant. Inside the workshop, there was only him, the wheel, and the clay. The wheel spun, the shape formed, a bowl this time. Wide, shallow, meant for mixing herbs or crushed olives. He thought about the woman who might use it, the hands that would lift it, the meals it would accompany. When he finished, he placed it alongside the others to dry. Then he sat in the shade of the doorway, cup in hand, listening to the rustle of leaves and the soft creak of wood in the breeze. His muscles were tired, but not sore. It was a good kind of tired, earned, slow, peaceful. He did not chase time. He shaped a dot as the sun moved across the sky. Shadows shifted slowly over the worn stones of the courtyard. Damon rested for a short while beneath the pomegranate tree, its branches arching overhead like the ribs of a natural temple. The leaves quivered faintly in the light afternoon breeze, their soft rustling mingling with the chirp of cicadas hiding in the olive groves beyond. He watched the light change, from the bright gold of midday to the softer amber tones of early afternoon. The world was warm, still, wrapped in its own quiet routine. Far off, a shepherd sang a short, lilting tune as he guided his flock across the slope. The sound carried like a ribbon, winding lazily through the valley air. After a while, Damon stood and returned to his wheel. There was more to shape, more to refine, but there was no urgency. The day would give him what time he needed. The rest could wait for tomorrow. He worked next on a small jar, the kind often used to hold perfumes or healing oils. The clay responded to his touch with smooth obedience, rising under his fingers in a graceful spiral. He added a slender neck, perfect for pouring in delicate streams. As he shaped, he remembered how his mother once kept such a jar by her bedside, filled with lavender steeped in olive oil. She used to dab it on her temples when the summer heat made her head heavy. The scent of lavender came to him now, not strong, just the echo of it, drifting on memory. With the jar completed, he turned to the kiln. Its rounded belly of stone was dark and quiet, but it held the promise of transformation. Damon inspected the fire pit beneath, clearing out the old ash and preparing for the next firing. He arranged the wood nearby, olive branches, dry pine, and small bundles of vine cuttings, each chosen for the heat they offered and the scent they would bring. He would fire the batch tomorrow. Today was for preparation, not for flame. The firing itself required full focus, patience, and precision. The temperature had to be just right, to cool, and the clay would remain soft. Too hot, and the vessels could crack, or worse, melt beyond. Saving? No, tomorrow was better. The jars, like the potter, needed time. He spent some time arranging the drying shelves, turning the pieces slightly to catch even air on all sides. The rows of bowls, cups, and vases stood like a quiet congregation, waiting for their moment of becoming. Damon moved among them with care, hands light, eyes thoughtful. It was not just pottery to him. It was continuity, of craft, of earth, of human need and beauty. By mid-afternoon, the village settled into its lull. The sun was high, and most people took refuge in shade or indoors. Damon sat once again near the window inside, sipping more cool water and nibbling on olives and a few almonds. The room was dim and cool, the stone walls thick enough to keep the heat outside. A faint scent of clay lingered in the air, earthy, grounding. He took a scroll from a shelf and unrolled it slowly. It was a poem by Hesiod, words he had copied himself over the winter months. He read quietly, his lips forming the verses. In silence, letting the rhythm of the lines blend with the hum of the afternoon. The words spoke of seasons, of labor, of honoring the land and the gods with one's daily work. They felt familiar, woven into his own way of life. Outside, a few villagers passed now and then, their steps slower in the heat. One woman paused by his gate and called softly, "Damon, have you any of the wide bowls ready?" He rose, set the scroll aside, and stepped out with a gentle greeting. "I have to. Come, see which one speaks to you." She entered, her sandals whispering across the stone floor. Her name was Eleni, a weaver whose home was near the eastern edge of the village. She had kind eyes, quick fingers, and a quiet laugh. She looked over the bowls carefully, lifting each with practiced hands. "This one," she said, running her fingers along the curve of the larger piece. "It feels balanced." Damon nodded. "It will hold what you need. It's good for grain or fruit." They exchanged the bowl for a small pouch of olives and dried figs, a fair and familiar trade. She offered thanks, not in many words, but with a warm glance and a slow nod. Then she stepped back into the sunlit path, bowl held gently in both hands, disappearing around the curve of the hill. The potter returned to his workshop, pleased. There was something sacred about giving shape to something useful, an object that would sit in another's home, hold their food, become part of their everyday moments. As the shadows grew longer, Damon stepped back into the courtyard. The sky began to soften, losing its harsh blue edge. The color became a deeper hue, tinted with rose and gold. The birds returned to the branches, chirping their low evening songs. The breeze returned, cooler now, like a sigh after a long breath. He looked over the courtyard one last time, checking the kiln, the vessels, the buckets of water, and the cloths. Everything was in its place. The day's work had been steady, calm, full. There had been no hurry, no grand event, just the turning of the wheel, the shaping of clay, the flow of time through quiet hands. He lit a small lamp inside and washed, once more with cool water, letting the droplets run over his fingers, down his arms. He dried them slowly, folded the cloth, and set it in its place. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew the rhythm of his life, who did not need to search for more, because he had already found what mattered. As twilight began to settle, across Delphi, the potter's house glowed faintly from within, a quiet sanctuary, where earth and fire, water and air came together through one man's humble hands. Evening descended softly over Delphi. The last rays of sunlight skimmed the mountain tops before slipping gently behind them, leaving the valley in a dusky glow. Shadows lengthened across the village lanes, and lanterns began to flicker to life one by one, small beacons of warmth in the growing blue. Damon moved through his home as the sky dimmed, lighting his own lamp with a quiet breath and a flint spark. The wick caught with a soft hiss, and golden light pooled into the corners of the room. The walls, colored with decades of soot and clay dust, took on a deeper hue. Glowing faintly in the lamp's embrace, he prepared a simple evening meal. Lentils cooked earlier in the day, paired with crusty bread and a drizzle of olive oil. A few olives, a wedge of cheese, and a fig to finish. The food was humble, but every bite held the taste of familiarity, of patience. He ate slowly, chewing with care, his thoughts as quiet as the room around him. Outside, the village had grown still. The shops had closed, their wooden shutters drawn and bolted. Smoke rose in faint columns from the chimneys of the baker, the weaver, the smith. Dogs curled near doorways. A child's laugh rang faintly, followed by the low murmur of a parent's voice, calming and steady. Damon stepped outside again, bowl in hand, and sat beneath the pomegranate tree. The stars were beginning to show, soft pinpricks in a sky that deepened with every breath. He leaned back slightly, letting his head rest against the sun-warmed wall. The scent of earth and stone mixed with the cooling air, creating something rich and grounding. He listened, not for any particular sound, but for the space between them. The hush of the village, the rustle of leaves, the far-off creak of a wooden cart returning from the foothills. These were the sounds of a life lived close to the land. As the stars multiplied, Damon's thoughts drifted like wind over water. He remembered his father, a man with strong hands and a deep laugh, who had taught him to shape bowls and mix glazes when he was no older than Nicodemus. He remembered sitting at the wheel for the first time, clay slipping through his fingers, too soft, too fast, and yet even then, there had been something in the act that felt like truth. He had not always lived alone. Years ago, his wife, Maya, had filled these rooms with her weaving, her songs, her gentle presence. She had passed too soon, taken by illness in a harsh winter. But her touch remained in the blue-dyed cloth that still covered the table, in the jar she'd painted with waves and birds, in the memories that lived in Damon's quiet routines. He did not speak of her often, but in the silence, she was never far. After finishing his meal, he rose and placed the empty bowl in a basin. He would wash it tomorrow, tonight. The work was done. The vessels had been shaped. The kiln stood ready. His hands had done their part before. Returning inside, he stepped toward the edge of the courtyard, where a low stone wall opened to a view of the valley. From here, the lights of Delphi twinkled faintly, scattered like stars that had settled gently upon the earth. The temple of Apollo rose in the distance, its white marble glowing faintly under the moonlight. Pilgrims would come again soon, walking the sacred path, bringing offerings, seeking wisdom from the oracle. Damon, too, had walked that path once, many years ago, not with grand questions of fate or ambition, but with a quiet heart. He had asked only to be useful, to live in peace, to make what was needed, and to leave behind something of use and beauty. The oracle had not spoken directly, but he had felt his answer in the stillness of the chamber, in the scent of burning laurel, in the cool stone beneath his knees. That was enough. He turned back toward his home, closing the wooden gate behind him. The courtyard felt warmer now, like a cocoon against the night. Inside, the lamp flickered gently, casting slow-moving shadows that danced across the floor. He stretched his arms, then unwrapped a small bundle from a corner shelf, a piece of cloth containing Maya's favorite oil jar. He held it for a long moment, fingers brushing the painted lines that curved around its belly. Ivy, birds, waves, stars. He uncorked it and dabbed a little of the oil on his temples. Lavender and myrrh, a scent of memory, of love. As he prepared for sleep, he folded the woolen blanket over his mat, lay down, and let out a slow, deep breath. His body sank into the quiet, and the silence folded around him like water over a stone. The night held him, as it had for countless nights before. Outside, the moon climbed higher. The hills shimmered silver, and the olive trees stood like guardians of sleep. All was still in Delphi, and the potter, surrounded by the work of his hands and the echoes of gentle lives, drifted slowly into rest. Morning arrived once more in Delphi, not with sudden brightness, but with a quiet blooming of light that touched the stones and rooftops like a gentle hand. The sun, still low on the horizon, painted the valley with pale gold and long shadows, and the air carried a soft chill, the kind that whispers of day but still holds the hush of night. Inside his home, Damon stirred awake. His sleep had been deep and undisturbed, wrapped in the comfort of silence and the faint scent of the lavender oil still lingering in the air. He sat up slowly, pausing for a moment to stretch his arms, then stood and moved to the basin to wash his face with cold water. The splash was bracing, but refreshing, a reminder that a new day, like each vessel of clay, waited to be shaped. After dressing in his usual tunic and pulling on his worn leather sandals, he opened the shutter to let the morning light spill into the room. Dust motes danced gently in the sunbeam, and the air smelled faintly of dew, clay, and pomegranate blossoms. Outside, the leaves whispered with a soft breeze, and the world felt as though it were holding its breath, not in tension, but in peace. Today was a firing day. He moved through his morning preparations with quiet purpose. First, he ate some bread, olives, and a few almonds, washed down with a cup of clear spring water. Then, he gathered the vessels he had selected for the kiln, a tall amphora, 3 bowls, 2 oil jars, and a pair of wide, shallow dishes. Each piece was dry to the touch but not brittle. They had rested, hardened, and now were ready to become something permanent. One by one, he inspected each vessel again. No cracks, no weaknesses. The amphora had a spiral motif around its neck, carved with care. The oil jars bore simple handles, their bodies balanced and even. Damon nodded to himself. These were good. Each one a silent testament to patient hands and time well spent. He began building the fire in the pit beneath the kiln. First the kindling, dry twigs, pine needles, and bark, then larger branches, arranged with care to allow airflow and a steady rise in heat. He lit the fire and stepped back, watching as it caught slowly, then began to glow. Smoke drifted upward in lazy curls. The fire would take time to grow. The pottery could not be rushed into the heat. It had to warm gradually. Damon tended to the flame with the same quiet patience he used at the wheel. Feed it, let it breathe, give it time. As the fire grew, he stacked the vessels inside the kiln, carefully, mindfully, with space between each piece so the heat could move freely. The interior of the kiln was dark, blackened from many firings. It was like the inside of the earth, a place of transformation, where clay became stone, and form became permanence. Once the last vessel was in place, he sealed the kiln door with a thick stone slab, leaving only the vent at the top open to allow the smoke and heat to escape in a controlled flow. Then he returned to the fire, feeding it slowly as the temperature rose. The hours passed quietly. Damon remained nearby, sometimes sitting on the low stool beside the kiln, sometimes walking through the courtyard, checking the flames. He did not leave the process, not because he feared mistakes, but because this was the heart of the work. The shaping of clay was only the beginning. The fire was what finished it. As the day warmed, a few villagers passed by, calling quiet greetings over the wall. Damon raised a hand or nodded, but he remained focused. The scent of burning pine and clay filled the air, rich, warm, ancient. The smoke rose straight into the sky, and birds flew in circles above, as if curious about the gentle column rising from the courtyard. By midday, the fire was strong and steady. Damon adjusted the vent, reducing the airflow slightly, allowing the heat to saturate the kiln chamber. He would keep it like this for several more hours before letting it cool. To fast, and the pottery might crack. To slow, and it would not vitrify. Like all things in his craft, balance was everything. He took a break in the shade, sipping water and nibbling a handful of dried figs. The sun shimmered through the olive leaves, dappling the ground with soft gold. The world around him was quiet, still, a slow heartbeat of wind and warmth and work. As the afternoon wore on, Damon tended the fire one last time, then let it begin its long cooling. The kiln would take until the following morning to return to a safe temperature. He would not know until then whether the vessels had survived, but he felt confident. His instincts, honed over years, rarely failed him now. With the fire reduced to glowing coals, he walked through the courtyard and into his home, leaving the kiln to rest. The air inside was cool, and the scent of burning wood clung faintly to his skin. He washed his hands and arms once more, watching the soot and ash spiral into the basin like clouds. He sat at his worktable and began shaping a new piece of clay, not for firing today, but for tomorrow or the next day. The rhythm of the wheel returned, steady, familiar, as the clay turned and rose under his touch. He thought again of time, not as something to chase or fear, but as something that moved alongside him. The sun lowered behind the mountains, casting a soft light into the room. Damon worked until the shadows grew long again, until the new vessel had taken shape, until the clay felt right beneath his hands. He stopped then, setting the piece aside to dry, and stood in the doorway once more, watching the sky turn from gold to blue to indigo. The stars would come soon, the fire would sleep beneath the stone, and the vessels, within their kiln sanctuary, would slowly become what they were meant to be. It was a quiet life, but it was full of form, of warmth, of purpose. Damon took a deep breath, filling his chest with the cool air of evening, and let it go slowly. Another day had passed. Another piece of earth had been given shape. The night deepened with a quiet assurance, its darkness a comforting blanket draped across the village and hills. The stars hung above like scattered seeds of fire, glinting faintly through the olive branches outside Damon's home. Inside, the glow of the oil lamp softened the shadows, and the scent of clay and burned pine lingered gently in the air. Damon stood for a moment beside the window, listening. Far in the distance, the faint call of an owl echoed once, then faded into the hush. No carts rolled over the stones. No voices called from house to house. All was still. Satisfied with the day and the steady fading of the fire in the kiln, he extinguished the lamp and settled onto his mat. The blanket wrapped around him held the scent of home, of earth and time. He closed his eyes, and the darkness was complete, not empty, but full of quiet and rest. By the time dawn returned, soft and pale, the world had cooled. Dew clung to the stones of the courtyard, and the pomegranate leaves shimmered faintly as though dipped in silver. Damon rose with the light, stretching slowly and rolling his shoulders before opening the shutter once again. The air touched his face like cool cloth, a balm against the warmth that would return by midday. He moved to the kiln with practiced ease, placing his hand lightly against the outer stones. Still warm, but safe now. He waited a bit longer, then began to unseal the vent and remove the stone slab from the chamber's mouth. The scent that poured out was unmistakable: scorched pine, mineral earth, baked clay. It was the smell of completion. One by one, he lifted the pieces from inside, cradling each in cloth to shield against sudden air shifts. The amphora had turned a rich reddish brown, with flecks of deeper iron color spiraling around its neck. The bowls were smooth and even, their surfaces echoing the curve of his hands. The oil jars shone faintly, their glaze catching the morning light like water in motion. He examined each piece carefully, turning them, tapping them lightly with a knuckle. The sound, low, round, full, told him what he needed to know. They had survived. They were strong. They were ready for the world. He arranged them gently on the drying shelf, not to dry, but to rest, to cool fully and settle into their final form. Then he poured himself a cup of water and sat in the doorway again. Looking at the pieces, they were simple, as always, but in that simplicity lived something greater: usefulness, quiet beauty, permanence. He took satisfaction not in grand praise or fame, but in the knowledge that these vessels would serve, in homes, in kitchens, in temples, in silent corners of daily life. They would hold water, oil, grain, wine. They would be touched by other hands, filled with other stories. And though they would carry no signature, those who used them would feel the care. In their shape, later that morning, a few neighbors stopped by. Eleni, returning for another bowl. An older man, seeking a vessel large enough for pickled onions. A shepherd who wanted a sturdy jar to carry water into the hills. Damon welcomed each with the same calm presence, guiding them, offering options, accepting trade not only in coin but in cheese, herbs, and stories. They lingered in his courtyard, speaking softly, admiring the newly fired pieces. One complimented the color of the glaze. Another asked if Damon would ever teach others, perhaps start a school of pottery. He only smiled. "The wheel is always here," he said simply. "Anyone willing to learn is welcome." By midday, the visitors had gone. The courtyard was quiet again, filled only with the sound of wind brushing leaves and the faint trickle of water. From the nearby spring, Damon sat at his worktable and began shaping. Another piece of clay, a plate this time, wide, flat, with a slight upward curve at the edges. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, coaxing the shape into life. Round him, the familiar smells and textures settled in, the damp earth of fresh clay, the gritty feel of sand, the rhythmic hum of the spinning wheel. Time passed without notice. He stopped only when the shape felt right, not perfect, but honest. He placed it gently on the board beside the others and rose to stretch Dot in the afternoon sun. The courtyard took on a different tone. The colors were warmer, the air thicker, but within the thick stone walls, all remained cool and measured. Damon watered the pomegranate tree, watching as droplets sank into the thirsty soil, and then turned to refill the basin for cleaning. He washed his tools, the wire cutter, the shaping sticks, the smooth stones used to burnish the surfaces of his vessels. Each tool had its place. Each bore the marks of years of use. He laid them back in their wooden box and tied the cloth cover securely. By the time the sun began its descent once more, casting a soft orange glow over the village, Damon stepped outside his gate and walked slowly down the lane. He passed the baker's home, where fresh loaves cooled on a windowsill. He paused by the olive press, nodding to an old friend who was greasing the turning beam. He climbed a small rise just beyond the village where the temple path began. From there, He could see the valley below, green and gold in the late light, stretching toward the horizon like a painted scroll. The mountains beyond stood quiet and proud, eternal witnesses to the slow lives unfolding beneath them. He sat on a flat stone, watching as the shadows deepened and the sky shifted again, this time toward twilight. Birds flew in slow circles above, returning to roost. A bell sounded once from the temple, deep and resonant, marking the end of day. Damon let his thoughts drift, not to worries or questions, but simply to being, here on this hill, with the scent of earth and olive in the air, the sky opening above and the quiet hum of life below. He felt whole, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in the gentle, enduring sense of belonging. He stayed until the stars came out, until the air cooled and the light faded fully into night. Then he rose, walked slowly back home, and closed the gate behind him. The stars above Damon's home blinked quietly, forming the same familiar constellations he had watched since boyhood. Orion hunting above the mountain line, the seven sisters dancing low in the sky. The pomegranate tree's leaves rustled gently as he passed under them once more, stepping into the dim glow of his oil lamp, already lit and waiting inside. He placed a hand on the wooden doorframe before entering, the grain smooth from years of touch within. The air was cool, holding a trace of clay, warm bread, and old stone. He crossed the room, placing the small pouch of herbs he'd received from the olive pressman on the table, beside a half-finished bowl that would dry overnight. His evenings followed no schedule, only quiet rituals, a slow folding of the day into night. He dipped a cloth into fresh water and wiped his hands, feeling the fatigue in his wrists, a gentle ache that spoke of honest work. He poured himself a little watered wine and took a seat near the window, gazing out into the night. The village beyond was resting too. The glow from nearby homes was faint, some flickering out already as families slipped into sleep. A dog barked once far off, but even that sound faded quickly into the stillness. It was in these hours when nothing demanded him that Damon often felt most at peace, not because the work was done, but because everything had found its place. He sipped slowly, the wine cool and mild. Then, without hurry, he opened the worn wooden box near his table. Inside, scrolls neatly rolled and bound with strips of linen. He chose one, unrolling it with care. It was a text he had read many times, a gentle tale of a shipwright who dreamed of birds, written in a flowing hand that may have belonged to a traveling scribe. He didn't read it tonight for knowledge, but for the shape of its rhythm. The words that moved like a stream, familiar and soft dot as his eyes moved down. The scroll, his thoughts wandered again, not in distraction, but in meditation. He thought of the young boy, Nicodemus, who had returned twice now with his father. He had shown a natural curiosity, his hands already mimicking the shaping motions Damon used at the wheel. Perhaps, one day, the boy would stay and learn. He would teach him not just how to make pottery, but how to listen to the clay, to the fire, to the quiet between tasks. This, Damon believed, was where the real craft lived. After a while, he rolled the scroll gently and replaced it. He stood, stretched again, and moved about the room, checking the window latch, folding the cloth on the table, placing the wine jug back onto its shelf. Each movement was slow, considered, not in ritual, but in care. Before he prepared for sleep, he knelt briefly by the small household altar in the corner of the room. A simple shelf, carved from olive wood, holding small offerings, a smooth stone from the river, a piece of dried thyme, and a tiny figure of Athena, worn by time but dignified still. He offered a silent thanks, not for anything specific, but for the day, for the work, for the quiet. The oil lamp flickered gently, casting long, soft shadows across the walls. Damon extinguished it with a slow breath, then moved to his mat. He lay down and let the silence return. His sleep was unhurried, the kind that welcomed him slowly, layer by layer, like stepping into a warm pool. Outside, the wind shifted faintly through the leaves. Inside, time became gentle, stretched between breaths, and Damon drifted deeper into rest. When dawn came again, it brought with it a soft pink hue that crept across the stones of his home. He awoke without alarm, Body already tuned to the slow unfolding of morning, he rose, washed, and stepped into the courtyard, barefoot on the cool ground. The kiln was still now, cold and silent, its work complete for the time being. The shelves nearby held the finished pieces, each one a small echo of the day it was formed. Damon walked among them, touching one, then another, as if greeting old friends later. As he swept the floor of the workshop and laid out new slabs of clay to rest, a traveler appeared at his gate, a woman dressed in a dusty robe. Carrying a woven bag, she greeted him with a nod and stepped into the courtyard. Her eyes moved across the shelves, pausing here and there. "I heard of your vessels," she said. "I've come from Amphissa." Damon offered a quiet welcome, guiding her to the newly fired amphorae. She examined them in silence, her fingers testing the balance and weight. "This one," she said, finally choosing a wide-mouthed jar with twin handles. "It's for my sister's wedding." Damon wrapped it carefully in cloth, securing it with rope for travel. She offered coins in return, more than he expected, but he did not argue. Some days, the value of a vessel was in its destination. After she left, the day unfolded with more shaping, more quiet spinning of the wheel. He worked steadily through the morning, creating bowls for a neighbor's kitchen and a tall pitcher for storing spring water. Around him, life continued in soft circles, birds nesting near the roof, bees humming in the lavender, the distant beat of hooves as a farmer passed along the road. In the afternoon, Damon paused to rest beneath the pomegranate tree, now thick with leaves and early fruit. The breeze brushed his cheek, warm but kind. He leaned back, arms folded behind his head, and watched the sky. In this life, there were no grand titles, no crowds calling his name, no legacy carved in stone. But in the vessels that held oil, in the plates that served meals, in the jars that traveled with strangers, there Damon's craft endured. And in the silence of his courtyard, he smiled. Another day passed with the soft pace that Damon had come to know so intimately, shaped not by the sun alone, but by the gentle cadence of his hands, the spinning of the wheel, the cooling of the kiln. He woke before the sky turned gold, his feet finding the stone floor by memory, and as he opened the shutter, the pale blue hush of dawn stretched over the hills like a long exhale. In the early silence, he prepared his tea, a few crushed herbs, a bit of honey, warm water. He sat with it in the courtyard, letting the warmth reach his fingers and the steam rise gently to his face. The scent of the pomegranate leaves was stronger this morning, the air still and heavy with the memory of yesterday's sun. As he sipped, his eyes moved across the workshop shelves. Some of the vessels from the last firing had already gone to new homes, traded or gifted, carried off by those in need of water jars, olive bowls, or quiet symbols of beauty. But several remained, and Damon took satisfaction in the thought that he'd made more than what was asked, creating room for future needs. He rose slowly, finished his tea, and moved to the wheel. The slab of clay he had prepared the previous afternoon had rested well. Its surface was smooth, its moisture perfectly balanced. He divided it carefully, shaping one lump into a sphere and pressing it onto the wheel's center. The spinning began, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Damon's hands hovered for a moment, then descended with practiced grace. The clay responded, rising upward beneath his fingers, wobbling slightly before finding its rhythm. As he shaped the vessel, a small urn with a rounded belly, he breathed evenly, his movements slow, nearly meditative. He did not speak. He rarely did while working. The language between hands and clay needed no words. A few hours later, he placed the urn on the drying board beside the others, brushing a damp cloth across his forearms to remove bits of grit. His hands, though worn, remained steady, shaped by decades of repetition and listening. The day stretched ahead, open and inviting. Instead of shaping another vessel immediately, Damon decided to walk, not far, just down the village path and toward the hillside where wild thyme grew in thick clusters. He often gathered herbs there, not only for cooking or scent, but simply to feel the texture of leaves, to hear the sound of bees in motion. The walk was quiet. The village was never loud, but in the mid-morning warmth, it seemed even more subdued. The baker's shutters were open, the smell of crusty loaves drifting into the air. A pair of women sat beneath a fig tree, weaving and humming softly to one another. Children's laughter rang out faintly behind a wall, followed by the clatter of a fallen pot, met not with scolding, but a calm, amused voice. Damon nodded to a few neighbors as he passed, exchanging only brief greetings. Words, he had learned, were like vessels, best when chosen with care. He reached the hillside and knelt by the thyme bushes, letting his hand pass through the low green leaves. The scent released into the air, sharp, clean, ancient. He picked a small bundle and tucked it into his satchel, then sat on a sun-warmed rock and looked back toward the village. From here, Delphi shimmered in the morning light. The rooftops glowed with clay-red warmth. The temple could just be seen in the distance, pale, strong, rising from its sacred terrace like a marble guardian. Smoke curled gently from chimneys, blending with the sky, and beyond, the mountains framed the scene like still sentinels, their edges softened by haze. Damon sat in silence for a long while, his thoughts not so much directed as floating. He thought of clay, of the vessels made and the ones still to be made. He thought of those who used them, of hands unknown, lifting bowls in morning light, pouring oil in small quiet rooms, storing olives against the colder seasons. He thought of the boy, Nicodemus, and wondered if he would return again soon. When the sun reached its highest point, he made his way back, the thyme swinging gently in his satchel. At home, he rinsed the leaves and set them to dry in the shade, then returned to his wheel. The next vessel, a tall, narrow pitcher, took shape under his fingers. Its walls were thin, delicate, meant not for carrying, but for ceremony. Perhaps an offering, perhaps nothing more than to be admired. Later, a friend stopped by, Philin, the weaver. He brought a small folded cloth, newly dyed, deep blue, with soft golden threads running through it. For your table, Philin said with a shrug, as if the gift meant little. But Damon could see the detail in the weave, the time it must have taken. He offered him a pair of bowls in return, ones he had glazed with a swirling pattern that reminded him of river water. They sat under the pomegranate tree for a while, not speaking much. It wasn't necessary. The breeze moved the leaves above them. The smell of thyme drifted faintly from inside when Philin left. The sun had already begun to slope westward. Damon finished cleaning his tools, washed the newly made pitcher, and set it beside the urn from earlier. The shelves were filling again. He took his evening meal simply, bread dipped in oil, a wedge of cheese, and a small apple sliced carefully onto a clay dish. As he ate, he watched the light fade from the room. The lamp flickered softly beside him, casting round halos onto the wall. Before retiring, he returned to the drying shelf once more. He ran his fingers over the pitcher, then the urn. Their surfaces were still cool, not fully set, but in their silence, they told him everything he needed to know. The day had been quiet, the work had been good, and the clay, like the life around it, had held steady. The night settled like a soft breath over the hills of Delphi, and within Damon's home, only the faintest glow from the lamp remained, flickering low, its flame swaying like a tired dancer. Outside, the courtyard was silvered by moonlight, and the shadows cast by the pomegranate tree moved slightly with the breeze. All around him, the world had stilled, the kind of stillness that felt timeless, as if even the air itself had fallen into a gentle sleep. Damon leaned back in his chair, the clay cup in his hand nearly empty. He wasn't thinking about much, not planning, not remembering, simply existing in the moment. The gentle hush of the evening allowed thoughts to come and go without urgency. In this place, time had no sharp edges. Eventually, he extinguished the lamp, the room darkening into a soft blur, and lay down once more beneath his blanket. The familiar sense of earth, ash, and clay were all around him, part of the very walls. The pillow beneath his head was modest, but he sank into it with ease, and sleep arrived not as a collapse, but like a hand guiding him into still water. The following morning began like all the others, quietly, slowly. Damon opened his eyes before the sun crested the horizon, his body already adjusting to the subtle rhythm of dawn. He rose, wrapped himself in his outer robe against the morning chill, and stepped into the courtyard. A low mist curled near the ground, and the garden stones were wet with dew. He knelt to touch a leaf on the pomegranate tree, turning it over. Gently between his fingers, the world felt fresh, untouched, a blank tablet waiting for the first careful mark dot as the light brightened. He began the day's work. The vessels he had shaped 2 days prior were nearly dry and ready for their first sanding. He carried them to the shaded side of the courtyard, where the sun wouldn't reach too harshly, and began smoothing their surfaces with a curved stone and fines and dot. It was delicate work. One too hard motion could crack the clay or thin a wall. Too much, but Damon's hands were steady, and his focus was soft but constant. As he worked, the texture of the clay changed under his fingers, from coarse to fine, from rough to satin. By midday, he had prepared 6 vessels, all ready to be fired in the next round. He stacked them near the kiln, covering them with a cloth to keep the dust away. Then he cleaned his hands, splashing water from the stone basin, watching it pool and swirl with the clay dust before disappearing into the ground. He made a simple meal, lentils with herbs, and a piece of bread still soft from the previous morning's baking. Afterward, he rested beneath the pomegranate tree again, lying back on the worn cushion that he kept just for such moments. The tree's branches offered just enough shade, and through the shifting leaves, he watched the sky drift from blue to a pale, glowing silver. The breeze picked up slightly, moving through the leaves and bringing with it the distant scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Somewhere further down the hill, a farmer's cart creaked over the stones. The low rumble steady and slow. Damon let himself drift, not quite asleep, not quite awake. His thoughts wandered gently to the shapes of future vessels, to the songs his mother used to hum when working at the loom, to the way the fire moved in the kiln like a living thing. He thought, too, of how many seasons had passed since he'd first set his hands to the clay. His master, long gone now, had been a patient man. Listen to the silence between steps, he used to say. That's where the real work happens. The words returned to Damon now, and he smiled faintly, eyes still closed. In the later afternoon, a boy approached the gate. It was Nicodemus, the young one who had visited before. Damon sat up slowly, brushing bits of dry leaf from his robe, and waved the boy in. "I've been thinking about your offer," Nicodemus said, standing straight, eyes wide and uncertain. "Then come," Damon said gently. "We'll begin again." The boy followed him to the wheel. Damon showed him how to prepare the clay, kneading it until all the air was worked out. He watched as Nicodemus pressed it onto the wheel head, awkward at first, then a little more confident with Damon's hand guiding his. Together, they shaped a simple cup. It wobbled, the rim was uneven, but it stood, and it held its form. And when the boy looked up, his face held a kind of wonder that made Damon's heart warm quietly. "Not bad," Damon said. "You listened." "I tried," Nicodemus replied. "That's all you need to do. The rest will come." They spent the rest of the daylight shaping one more piece. Then Damon showed him how to clean the tools, how to store the clay so it wouldn't dry too quickly, how to carry a vessel without touching its surface too firmly. When the boy left, the sun was dipping low again, and Damon stood at the gate for a moment, watching the child's small figure make its way down the path. It reminded him of his own early days, following a master's slow footsteps, returning to the workshop. He lit the lamp once more. The room filled with warm light, and the day felt full, not busy, not crowded, but gently complete. He sat once again beside the window, a small plate of dates and nuts beside him, the evening air cool against his skin. From the corner of the room, the freshly shaped vessels sat silently, their surfaces catching the lamp's glow. And outside, beneath the moon, the wheel waited for tomorrow. The morning sun crept up gently, brushing golden light over the low rooftops of Delphi. Birds chirped softly from the olive trees beyond the courtyard, and the dew sparkled like fine dust scattered across the stones inside the potter's home. Damon stirred, slowly blinking against the warmth filling his room. He sat up without rush, swinging his legs over the edge of the mat and resting his feet against the cool floor. The stillness of the early hour clung to everything, and Damon breathed in deeply, letting the soft air fill his chest. Another day had begun, not with the demands of noise or hurry, but with the same rhythm as always, quiet, steady, grounded. Outside, the sky was clear, a soft blue spread from horizon to horizon, and the smell of damp clay and distant cypress drifted through the open window. Damon stepped into his sandals and made his way into the courtyard where the vessels shaped the previous day waited in their cloth-covered rows. He touched each one gently, turning them slightly to catch the light. They were firm, nearly ready for the kiln. Before beginning the day's work, he walked to the spring near the edge of the village. It was not far, and he always found peace in the walk, the way the sunlight filtered through fig leaves, the crunch of gravel beneath his feet, the slow curve of the path leading downward. The spring bubbled softly over mossy stones, its water cold and clean. He filled a small jug and paused to listen to the gentle gurgle, a sound older than the town itself. Back at home, Damon poured some into a basin to wash his hands and face. The coolness refreshed him, and he dried his face with a simple cloth woven by a neighbor many years ago, still soft despite its age. Soon after, he moved to the wheel again. The day's work would be lighter, only a few small pieces to shape, a few tools to sharpen. He sat down and placed a new ball of clay at the center of the wheel. His foot tapped the pedal, setting the platform into its familiar, calming spin. The clay responded smoothly under his fingers, rising and widening as he coaxed it into a bowl, shallow, open, simple. He made two more, one deeper, for soup or stew, and another smaller, for spices or salt. As always, his hands moved with unforced precision, his mind quiet and focused. By midday, he had shaped half a dozen new vessels. He washed again and sat under the shade of the pomegranate tree, where the breeze stirred the leaves in gentle waves. A bee hovered near the flowering branches, then drifted off without sound. The world was so quiet that Damon could hear the grain shifting inside the walls of a neighbor's granary, the slow, rhythmic knock of someone pounding wheat a few houses away. He ate a piece of fresh bread, dipped in oil, and some figs from a small dish. Nothing more. His meals, like his work, were simple and slow. After eating, he leaned back, head resting against the smooth wall of the house, and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep, not fully, but drifted, thoughts soft and without direction. The patterns of clay, the arc of a kiln's fire, the glow of glaze after cooling, all these floated in and out, like waves lapping against a quiet shore. When he stirred again, the sun had shifted westward. He stood, stretched, and returned to the kiln. Today would be a firing day, not a large one, just enough to bake the last batch of small pieces. He opened the kiln carefully and arranged the vessels inside. The firewood was stacked and dry, ready for use. He kindled the flame slowly, feeding it with slivers of olive wood and pine. The fire caught with a soft crackle, then grew into a low roar, steady and sure. The heat began to rise inside the kiln chamber, and Damon monitored it carefully, adjusting the airflow with small shifts of the stones at the vent. He did not leave its side. Firing required patience, not constant motion, but presence. He sat nearby with a wooden stool, watching the flame through the narrow vent, occasionally checking the color of the smoke and the temperature. By evening, the firing was complete. He sealed the vent and let the kiln rest. The vessels inside would cool overnight and into the next day, and only then would he know if they had held together, if the fire had worked its quiet transformation. The sky above had deepened into a rich twilight. Purple clouds streaked the horizon, and the scent of warm earth filled the air. Damon washed his hands again, then poured himself a cup of watered wine and returned to the shade of the pomegranate tree, which now stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. He looked up at the branches, the small fruits still ripening, the leaves whispering gently in the wind. The stars began to appear, one by one, as if someone were carefully placing them above. He thought, as he often did at this time, about the quietness of his life. There had been offers, long ago, to move to Athens, to open a larger workshop, to take on apprentices in number, but he had declined. This village, these hills, this slow way of shaping earth into something lasting, this was the life that made him whole, and each vessel that left his hands carried not only function, but calm, a rhythm of life baked into its surface. a kind of story that required no words. He sat for a long while in the dark, sipping his wine, listening to the hush of the night settle once more over Delphi. Then, when he was ready, he stood, stretched, again, and stepped into his home. He lit the lamp, placed the clay cup on its shelf, and rolled out his mat. The day, like the vessel in the kiln, had been formed and fired, and now it cooled into quiet completion. The next morning arrived like a whispered promise, subtle and unhurried. A coolness lingered in the stone walls of Damon's home, and the faint scent of yesterday's fire still clung to the air, not heavy, but familiar, like a fading memory. Birds had begun their quiet songs again, and the distant bleat of a goat reminded him that the village was gently waking with him. He moved through his home in silence, the same way he shaped his clay, without rush, with awareness. A cup of warm tea steamed in his hands soon after, and he stood in the doorway, watching the fog drift low over the valley, the peaks of the hills poking through like old gods rising from sleep. Today was an important one. The kiln had cooled overnight, and the time had come to open it. He waited until the sun had lifted above the rooftops before walking to it. His footsteps were steady, his breath even, and as he approached the stone structure, he placed a hand against its side to feel the warmth. It was still holding some heat, but not too much, just enough for safety and patience to meet. He bent down and carefully removed the clay plug from the fire hole. The scent that rose from within was deep and earthy, baked clay, ash, a touch of smoke. He removed the stones from the vent, one by one, then pulled back the covering cloth and peered inside. The vessels glowed faintly from the morning sun, but he could already see. The firing had gone well. There were no cracks, no signs of warping. The glaze had caught perfectly, a soft sheen running along the rims like captured moonlight. He smiled quietly to himself and reached in to lift the first one, a wide, shallow bowl with a curled edge. It was perfect, balanced, even, smooth to the touch. He placed it on the bench beside the kiln and reached for another. One by one, he removed them all. 6 vessels in total, 3 bowls, 2 small amphorae, and a vase with a narrow neck each. One held its own personality, its own curve and whisper of fire. When they were all laid out in a neat row, he sat back and admired them, not with pride, but with peace. This was the work of his hands, yes, but also of the earth, of the water, of time and wind and fire. He was only the guide, the quiet arranger of elements. Later, he walked through the village with 2 of the bowls wrapped carefully in cloth. One was for a widow named Calionera, who had broken her only large bowl weeks ago. The other was for the healer, an old man with a limp, who had always offered Damon herbs and teas without asking for anything in return. He knocked gently at their doors, offering the vessels without words. Each one received with a warm nod and a quiet thanks. These moments, the exchange, the silent respect, felt more valuable to Damon than any coins or praise. Returning home, he found Nicodemus waiting at the gate again. The boy had brought his own piece, a small cup he'd shaped alone, slightly tilted, but holding form. Damon examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands. "Tell me about this," he said. "I made it after dinner last night. I tried to remember how you moved your hands. And how did it feel?" "Hard," Nicodemus admitted, "but good, like it wanted to become something." Damon nodded. "That's when you know it's working." He showed the boy how to sand the surface, how to check for air bubbles, how to prepare it for the next firing. They worked side by side for a while, quietly. The only sounds were the brushing of cloth against clay, and the distant tapping of a woodworker's mallet echoing through the hills. At midday, they shared lunch beneath the pomegranate tree, bread, olives, and a wedge of soft cheese. Damon handed Nicodemus a piece of dried fig and asked him what he dreamed of. "Maybe I'll have my own kiln," the boy said. "Or maybe I'll travel and see how others work with clay. I want to see what's beyond the hills." Damon smiled faintly. "That's a good dream. Just remember, wherever you go, the clay will always be the same. Listen to it." "I will," Nicodemus said, his eyes serious, his fingers still stained with fine dust. After the boy left for the day, Damon returned to his wheel. There was no pressing task, no commission, but he wanted to shape something, just for himself. He placed a fresh lump of clay at the center and began again. This time, he let his hands move freely. He didn't think about size or balance, about function or use. He simply listened to the feel of the spinning clay, to the memory in his fingers, to the silence in the room. The vessel that emerged was unusual. Not quite a cup, not quite a vase, something in between, with curved sides that folded inward like petals. When it was done, he held it in his lap and looked at it closely. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right. He set it on the shelf near the window where the evening light would catch it. Then he stood, rolled his shoulders, and stepped back outside. The air was cooling again. The birds had returned to the trees. Somewhere beyond the village, a shepherd was calling to his flock, and within all of it, Damon felt deeply still. Another day had passed, like the others before it, slow, honest, full. The kind of day that left behind no noise, only the soft imprint of peace. Night had once again drawn its quiet veil across Delphi. The wind had softened into gentle sighs along the stone paths, and the village sat in stillness, as if even time itself had stopped to listen. In Damon's courtyard, a faint glow from his oil lamp flickered behind the open shutters, casting soft shadows against the clay-covered walls. Inside, the potter moved without sound. He gathered the small scraps of leftover clay, returned tools to their shelves, and wiped down the wheel. These motions were as much ritual as necessity, a way of closing the day's work, of honoring the labor that had passed. On the shelf by the window, the unusual vessel he had shaped that afternoon caught the faint glow of lamplight. It stood quiet and dignified among the others, a soft reminder that even in repetition, something new could still emerge. After finishing his tasks, Damon poured a final cup of warm tea, a gentle infusion of thyme and dried rose petals, and stepped into the courtyard to sit beneath the pomegranate tree. The stars above shimmered with ancient light, scattered across the sky like bits of crushed quartz in a dark glaze. He leaned back and looked up, letting his breath slow to match the rhythm of the night. It was in these moments, between day and dreams, that he felt closest to everything: the clay, the earth, the breath of the wind, the warmth of the kilns. Memory, he was not apart from them. He was part of them. He drank slowly, the warm liquid soothing against the cool night air. From the hills came the faint rustle of an owl's wings, a single hoot echoing gently through the valley. The olive trees swayed softly, their silver leaves catching bits of moonlight like quiet signals between the land and sky. And in the hush of it all, Damon smiled, not with his lips, but from somewhere deeper, that quiet joy found in a life lived fully, though simply. The next morning, he woke again before the sun, as always. The day began as it always did, with breath, with stillness, with care. Nikitas arrived early, his steps a bit more confident than before. He carried a wrapped bundle, not just the cup he had made, but a sketch he had drawn of a kiln he imagined building someday. Damon unwrapped it slowly, examining the boy's vision. The proportions were modest, the chimney drawn to short, the base slightly uneven. But the idea was there, the spirit of it, the care. He nodded. "You've been thinking." "I want to try," Nikitas said. "Not just the wheel, the whole process." Damon rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then we begin with bricks, together." They gathered clay and sand and began to shape the first of what would become the boy's practice kiln. Not a full structure, not yet, but a model, small and manageable. They shaped the bricks with wooden molds, then set them in the sun to dry. Damon showed him how to test the clay for strength, how to smooth the edges for tight stacking, how to leave room for the fire to breathe throughout. The day they worked, not fast, but steadily. They paused to rest, to drink water, to share slices of fruit beneath the pomegranate tree. Nikitas asked questions, sometimes about the clay, sometimes about the stars. Damon answered what he could, and when he didn't have an answer, he smiled and let the silence hold them. In the afternoon, when the sun was warm but no longer harsh, they visited the kiln again. Damon opened it to check the test pieces he had placed inside. Among them, Nikitas's first cup. It had fired well. The glaze had caught slightly uneven, pooling near the base. But there were no cracks, no flaws that mattered. He handed it to the boy, who held it with both hands. as though it were something sacred. "I did this," he whispered. "You listened," Damon said again. That evening, after the boy had gone home and the village had fallen quiet once more, Damon sat by the fire. The coals in the brazier glowed softly, casting a gentle warmth that pushed back the chill. He held a new piece of clay in his lap but didn't shape it. Not yet. He simply let it rest in his palms, feeling its cool promise. There would always be more vessels, more mornings, more tea, more silence. But in this moment, there was nothing missing. Everything: the quiet rhythm of his breath, the lingering scent of glaze and earth, the hush of a world at peace was whole. He closed his eyes and let the stillness fill the space around him like water settling in a jar. Tomorrow would come, and he would be ready. The following morning broke with the softest of hues. The sun had not yet risen, but the sky was already beginning to shift from deep blue to a pale, expectant gray. In the stillness before dawn, Damon sat awake, already dressed, sipping warm tea from one of his oldest cups. The clay had thinned over the years and a small crack curved delicately along the side, but it held. And that was enough. Today would be a quiet day, not for shaping or firing, but for observing, for maintaining, for grounding. These days were necessary too. Just as a vessel must rest before it is fired, so must its maker pause between the press of tasks. Outside, the world held its breath. The courtyard was silent except for the soft rustle of vines in the breeze. Damon took his broom and began to sweep the stone paths, slowly guiding leaves and dust into a neat pile. It was meditative work, the scratch of bristles, the sweep of arms, the rhythm of motion. When the paths were clear, he knelt beside the herb jars and checked their contents. The thyme was growing low. He would need to gather more from the hillside later this week. The sage, though, was plentiful. Its scent strong and steady as he opened the lid. By the time the sun cleared the hills, the courtyard was washed in golden light. Damon laid out the unfired vessels Nikitas had helped shape the day before. Their surfaces had stiffened overnight, drying just enough to be handled again. He turned each one gently in his hands, smoothing a rim here, shaving a thickened edge. There, his fingertips traced each curve like a reader following lines of poetry. Later, he unwrapped a parcel that had arrived the evening before, a gift from a traveling merchant who passed through the village once every few moons. Inside were pigments, ochre, red iron, and a rare touch of blue. Damon rarely painted his pieces, preferring the quiet voice of bare clay, but every now and then when the vessel asked for it, a whisper of color brought life to the form. He ground the pigments slowly with a mortar and pestle, mixing them with water and a little slip from the same clay he used. Then, with a narrow brush made from horsehair, he tested a line across a shard of discarded pottery, watching how the colors settled, how they bled, how they dried. When Nikitas arrived later that morning, Damon greeted him with a nod and passed him the test shard. "Try," he said simply. Nikitas dipped the brush and carefully drew a small spiral. It wobbled, the brush catching slightly, but the mark was clear and purposeful. "Good," Damon said. "The clay listens to this too." They worked together in silence for a while, painting a single vessel with faint lines around the rim. Nothing loud, just a suggestion of wind, of movement, of time passing. It was the first piece Nikitas had painted. Afterward, they cleaned the tools and sat under the pomegranate tree again. The sun had climbed, but the shade was still cool, the stones beneath them warm. They shared a bowl of lentils and slices of honeyed barley cake, washing it down with water from the jug kept cool in the shadows. Nikitas looked thoughtful as he ate. "Do you ever get tired of making the same shapes?" he asked. Damon chewed quietly, then shook his head. "They're never the same, but bowls and jars, they're all similar." He held up the bowl between them. A small one, shallow, with a rim slightly turned inward. "Look closer. This one curves more than the last. The base is broader. The clay was stiffer. The day was warmer. My thoughts were different." Nikitas turned the bowl slowly in his hands. "They're like moments," Damon continued. "They seem the same if you rush past them, but when you stop and listen, each one speaks in its own way." The boy was silent for a while, absorbing the thought. Then he nodded slowly, as if beginning to understand. That afternoon, They didn't return to the wheel. Instead, Damon showed Nikitas how to mend a cracked storage jar, a larger piece that had belonged to the village baker. It had split near the base but could be salvaged. They cleaned the break, applied a fine slurry of fresh clay, and bound the pieces together with cord and cloth. It would take days to cure, but it would hold. Clay is like people, Damon said. It can be broken, but if it's mended with care, it can still carry weight. Nikitas watched closely, his hands covered in the slurry, nodding again. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Damon lit a small lamp and placed it on the ledge near the bench. The light flickered softly against the walls, dancing across shelves lined with vessels, some old, some new, some perfect, some flawed. All were part of the rhythm of his life. He sat with his back against the wall, stretching his legs out slowly, letting the day's labor settle into his bones. Nikitas sat nearby, eyes heavy, but still curious. "What did your master teach you?" the boy asked quietly. Damon smiled faintly. "To wait." "Wait for what?" "For the clay to speak, for the fire to cool, for silence to show the shape of things." The boy looked thoughtful again, then leaned back against the wall, mirroring Damon's posture. In the quiet that followed, neither spoke. The wind moved gently through the courtyard. The pomegranate leaves whispered. A dog barked in the distance. Time stretched, soft and slow, like a glaze cooling over fresh clay. Another day, shaped by care, passed without ceremony, only presence, and in its passing, there was peace. The next day began with mist curling low across the valley, like soft threads woven through the olive trees. The sky was pale and cool, with the promise of sunlight behind its gauzy veil. Damon rose before the first full light reached the hills, stretching his arms in the quiet warmth of his small home. There was no urgency in his movements, no sharpness. In his breath, only the same measured rhythm that guided everything he did. He stepped outside into the muted air. The cobbled courtyard stones were still cool beneath his sandals. Birds had not yet begun their full morning chorus, but one or two soft calls drifted from the fig trees nearby. He placed his hand gently against the surface of the large storage jar they had mended. The day before, the cords still in place, the new clay still drying. It would take time, but it would heal. Like all good things, it asked only for patience. Today, he decided, would be a day for walking. There were no firings to tend, no vessels urgently awaiting his wheel. The clay, too, needed rest, and sometimes the potter needed to step away to feel the land that had given him his craft. He packed a cloth bag with a bit of cheese, a heel of bread, and a small clay flask of water. Then he began his walk through the upper paths of Delphi, past the terraced gardens, past the shepherd's low stone wall, and up toward the foothills where wild thyme and lavender grew freely between rocks. The path curved gently upward, shaded, at first by pines, then opening into stretches of sun-dappled meadow. As he walked, Damon ran his fingers along the leaves of the plants that lined the trail, their scents rising into the morning air, earthy, sweet, familiar. It was quiet here, not silent, but calm. The buzzing of bees, the flutter of a bird taking off, the shifting of pebbles beneath his step. Nature's own kind of wheel, turning gently, always in motion, yet never hurried. He found a spot beneath a low cypress where the earth was soft, and the view overlooked the rooftops of Delphi. He sat, unwrapped his bread and cheese, and ate slowly, watching the smoke rise lazily from village chimneys far below. The pottery workshop was just visible, a dot of roof tiles and shadows. From here, even his will seemed distant, part of a world gently turning without him. It was good, he thought, to step away and see from afar, to remember that even the things we shape are shaped by the spaces we leave between them. After some time, he lay back against the hillside, letting the sun warm his face. The clouds drifted overhead in slow procession, like passing thoughts. He let them move through his mind the same way, without clinging, without force. When he rose again, the sun was high, and the mist had fully lifted. The village was brighter now, more defined. The olive groves shimmered in silver waves. Damon took a longer path back, winding along the outer ridge, and then down through the narrow trails of clustered almond trees. whose young fruits had begun to form. Along the way, he gathered a few wild herbs, some sage, a small bundle of rosemary, and tucked them into his bag. Not much, just enough to dry and use slowly over the coming days. Back in the village, he paused at the well to draw a fresh bucket of water, nodding to the old woman who tended the goats nearby. They shared no words, just a glance and a smile, both of them comfortable in the space between speech. At home, he set the herbs on a drying tray and placed his bag aside. He filled a shallow bowl with water, added a few crushed sage leaves, and set it near the window. The scent lifted gently with the breeze, filling the room with something clean and grounding. Later, Nikitas returned. The boy's hands were already dusty, his eyes bright with something new. "I was thinking," he said, not waiting to be invited. "About texture." Damon raised an eyebrow slightly. "Texture, yes," Nikitas said. "How it feels, not just how it looks." Damon nodded. "Then let's find texture." He took the boy down to the old edge of the stream, where centuries of water had shaped the stones into soft, rippling patterns. They knelt, ran their fingers across the wet rocks, felt the lines carved by time and flow. "This," Damon said, placing Nikitas' hand against the stone's ridged surface, "is what wind feels like when it moves through clay. This is memory, set in earth." They collected a few small stones, dried them in the sun, and later pressed them gently into the surface of a newly thrown vessel, not to decorate, but to shape, to guide the clay into feeling like something more than smoothness. As twilight returned once more, Damon looked around the courtyard, the vessels resting, the drying herbs, the soft glow of the oil lamp, and felt that the day had asked for nothing more than presence. Each moment had been touched, not hurried through, not stretched thin, just felt. And in that feeling, a quiet life had spoken again. The next morning began with birdsong, soft, scattered notes across the rooftops, as if the world were slowly tuning itself for another gentle day. Damon awoke before the sun had fully touched the sky. The air was cool, but not cold, and a pale light glowed against the walls of his room. He moved with the grace of someone who had lived the same rhythm for many years. He did not rush to the wheel, nor did he prepare the kiln. Instead, he lit a small oil lamp and sat by the open window with a piece of bread and a handful of dried figs. He chewed slowly, watching the light shift from silver to gold. The stillness of early morning was his favorite companion, quieter than words, deeper than sleep. Even the wind seemed to wait before passing through his courtyard. He reached for a clay tablet he had been sketching on the day before, markings of a design he had seen in a dream. It was circular, with lines that radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel or ripples on water. There was no purpose to it yet, no vessel assigned, just the beginning of a thought. He set it aside and stood, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. Then he moved into the workspace, where the pieces he and Nikitas had textured the day before sat waiting, their forms matte and soft in the early light. He ran his fingers over the patterns they had pressed into the clay, small imprints from river stones, gently curved lines from carved wood, a faint tracing of fabric folds. Nikitas arrived not long after, his sandals scuffing against the stones, a quiet eagerness in his steps. His face lit up when he saw the vessels. "They look like wind," he said. Damon nodded, placing one in the boy's hands. "And they will feel like wind too when held. That's what matters most." They spent the morning preparing more clay. The rhythm of kneading and turning filled the courtyard with the soft music of work. Hands pressing, water splashing, clay folding into itself like time looping back again. By midday, they had shaped 3 new pieces. Damon had chosen to make a deeper vessel, one that flared slightly at the top like an opening flower. Nikitas tried a broader bowl, his fingers more confident with each pass. The third piece they made together, a double-handled cup, small and balanced, for no one in particular, just because. They set the pieces aside to rest, then took their lunch beneath the olive tree. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns across their faces. The food was simple: olives, bread, and a few slices of soft cheese. But Damon had long since learned that simplicity brought its own richness. Nikitas was quiet today, more thoughtful than usual. He finally spoke as he wiped his hands clean on a cloth. "Why don't you ever mark your pots?" Damon tilted his head. "You mean with my name?" Nikitas nodded. "Other potters do." Damon smiled faintly. "I suppose I don't need to. But why?" He picked up a small pebble and turned it over in his hand. "When you listen to the clay, really listen, it remembers you, your weight, your breath, your care. That's enough." Nikitas thought about that for a while, then leaned back and let the breeze move across his face. There were many ways to leave a mark, he realized, and not all of them needed to be seen later. They returned to the kiln. It had been dormant for a few days, and Damon thought it was time to prepare it for another firing. Together, they swept the ash from the firebox, checked the flue, and repaired a small crack near the base with fresh clay and sand. Preparing the kiln was just as sacred as shaping the vessels it would fire. It was a different kind of work, slower, more foundational, but equally filled with presence. By the time the sun began its descent behind the hills, the kiln stood ready once more, its mouth open and expectant like a sleeping creature, waiting to be awakened by flame. That evening, after Nikitas had gone home, Damon remained in the courtyard. He lit a single lamp and placed it near the shelf where their newest vessels rested. He did not work. He simply sat, allowing the silence to stretch and fold around him. The stars blinked into the sky one by one, each a quiet witness to the life being lived below. Somewhere in the distance, a flute played, faint and wistful, as if carried by the wind from another time. Damon let his eyes close, not to sleep, not yet, but just to feel the shape of the day behind him, the warmth still lingering. In the clay, the stillness that had grown like moss in the corners of his mind. A day of shaping, of silence, of gentle motion, a quiet life, a complete day. The morning came with a golden hush, as if the world had agreed to speak only in whispers. Damon stirred gently from sleep, letting his breath remain slow and steady as the light filtered into the small clay-walled room. Outside, birds fluttered through the fig trees, their wings brushing the branches like a quiet broom sweeping dawn into place. He rose without sound, pausing to press his palm against the cool wall, a gesture of grounding, a silent greeting to the home that had held him through so many seasons. Then, wrapping a light linen over his shoulder, he stepped outside. The courtyard welcomed him in its familiar stillness. The clay bowls, newly dried, rested in perfect stillness on their shelf. The kiln stood nearby, silent, but full of promise, like a musician waiting to lift their instrument again. He reached for the small broom, made of bundled reeds, and gently swept the courtyard stones. The sound was soft, like rain over parchment, a rhythm that matched his breathing. Each stroke cleared away yesterday's dust, making space for something new, even if that newness looked very much like the day before. Nikitas arrived just as the morning sun began to stretch long fingers across the edges of the wall. His eyes still held sleep, but there was a spark in them, the quiet energy of a question not yet spoken. Damon looked up from where he was polishing the lip of a vessel. "What's on your mind?" Nikitas shifted slightly. "I had a dream," Damon smiled and gestured for him to sit. "Tell me." The boy did, in simple words. A vision of a cup that poured water without end, of clay that glowed with the color of the sea, of a voice not seen, only heard, whispering patterns into his hands. Damon listened without interruption. When Nikitas had finished, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full, like the stillness between waves. "That dream," Damon finally said, "is already a vessel." Nikitas tilted his head. "But I haven't made anything. You've shaped it in your mind. Now you learn to shape it with your hands." They spent the morning working side by side. Damon let Nikitas choose the clay, the form, the purpose. The boy chose a tall cup, not for practical use, but for holding ideas. As he shaped it on the wheel, his hands trembled slightly, but his eyes remained steady. Damon guided when needed, but mostly he watched. By midday, the form was complete. It was not perfect. The rim tilted slightly, and the base was uneven, but it had life, a sense of movement, of reaching upward. They set the cup aside to dry, then shared a lunch of roasted lentils and slices of fresh fig beneath the pomegranate tree. The fruit had begun to ripen, and a few small blossoms clung stubbornly to the lower branches. As they ate, Damon spoke softly. "Dreams are like seeds," he said. "They take root in silence, in patience. When you listen to them, really listen, they begin to grow." Nikitas looked at his hands. "Sometimes I think I won't be good enough." Damon nodded. "That's part of the shaping. Doubt is a kind of pressure, the same as the wheel. It tests your center." They rested quietly after that, watching bees dance between the herbs. Time passed like a slow breeze. In the afternoon, they prepared the kiln. Damon had decided it was time for another firing, and he wanted to include Nikitas's textured bowl and the dream cup. Together, they arranged the vessels inside, spacing them with care, turning each one slightly so that the fire would find every surface. When the sun had begun to sink behind the hills, Damon lit the first small flame. It crackled in the kindling, then stretched upward with hunger. The fire took hold slowly, then built its own steady breath, filling the kiln with golden light. They sat beside it in silence, the heat warming their faces. Firing was always a waiting game, a trust in the flame to do its part, a surrender of control. As twilight deepened into dusk, Damon leaned back and closed his eyes, listening to the fire's voice. It crackled like distant thunder wrapped in silk. It told stories of transformation, of earth becoming vessel, of rawness becoming strength. Beside him, Nikitas stayed quiet, watching the dance of flame behind the kiln's small opening. His face glowed in the light, softened by the fading sun. It was a picture Damon would remember. The boy leaning toward the fire, between the past and his own becoming. That night, the stars came out slowly, one by one, as they always did. But to Damon, they felt closer, brighter, like they had come to witness. He stood and placed a hand gently on Nikitas's shoulder. "It's a good fire," he said. The boy nodded, not with excitement, but with quiet understanding. They would let it burn, they would wait, and tomorrow, the kiln would speak. The kiln glowed through the night, a soft amber eye watching the sky. Damon rose several times in the dark to check it, walking barefoot through the quiet courtyard, guided only by the hush of firelight. The moon hovered overhead, half veiled by wisps of cloud, casting a silver hue over the clay walls and the olive branches gently swaying above. Each time he approached the kiln, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The fire had its own rhythm, its own language. He could feel it in the temperature of the stones, in the scent of burning pine, in the soft tremble in the air around the kiln's mouth. By dawn, the fire had faded. Only a low bed of coals remained, pulsing with heat like a quiet breath. Damon stood still for a long moment, hands at his sides, simply listening. The vessels inside were hidden now, embraced by warmth, transforming in their own time. He would not open the kiln today. It needed to rest, cool slowly, undisturbed. He respected that. Some things, he had learned, couldn't be rushed. The clay had its own schedule, the fire its own will. When Nikitas arrived, he was quieter than usual, as if sensing the sacred stillness that surrounded the cooled kiln. Damon greeted him with a small nod and handed him a cup of barley tea. They sat in silence for a while. Beneath the fig tree, the steam from the cups curling into the morning air. Finally, Nikitas spoke, almost in a whisper. "Do you ever worry it won't work? That something inside might break?" Damon looked toward the kiln. "Sometimes, but that's part of the trust. The fire finishes what our hands begin." The boy nodded, accepting the answer not as a solution, but as a truth. With the kiln cooling, they turned their focus to other quiet tasks. Damon showed Nikitas how to repair the handles of old amphorae, those that had chipped or weakened with time, using slips made from finely ground clay and water. They reattached a pair of curved handles to a tall, weathered jar that had once held olives. Each step was careful, every touch deliberate. No rushing, no forcing. Later, they sifted through the clay bins, removing pebbles and roots. Damon explained how each season changed the texture of the earth, how winter clay held more water, how summer clay was drier and more brittle. As the sun climbed, the village sounds returned. Children laughing in the distance, a rooster calling from somewhere uphill, the soft patter of feet on worn stone. But within the pottery courtyard, The atmosphere remained gentle and undisturbed. By midday, they shared a small meal, roasted chickpeas, figs, and flatbread still warm from the morning's bake. Damon poured olive oil from a glazed jug he had made many years ago, its surface etched with vines and small birds. Nikitas examined the jug closely. "You made this," Damon smiled, "when I was not much older than you. It feels different, heavier, like it has stories." "It does," Damon said softly. "Every time I used it, I remembered something. That first year working alone. The morning the kiln cracked and I fixed it with mud and hope. The winter when the oil was scarce, and this jug held our last drops." Nikitas held the jug more carefully now. "Every piece carries memory," Damon said. "Some we shape into it. Some come afterward." That afternoon, Damon allowed himself a small nap beneath the pomegranate tree. The shade was cool, the air thick with the scent of fruit and bark. Nikitas worked quietly nearby, sketching designs in a clay tablet. He didn't disturb the silence. It had become a kind of teacher to both of them, a third presence in their daily rhythm. When Damon awoke, the sun had dipped lower and the light had softened. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his tunic, and approached the kiln once more. The warmth still clung to the stones, but the fiercest heat had passed. "It will be ready by tomorrow," he said. Nikitas came to stand beside him. "And if something broke, then we learn." The boy didn't seem afraid of that answer anymore. That evening, as they cleaned the workspace and covered the resting vessels with cloth, Damon took a small piece of unfired clay and handed it to Nikitas. "No instructions," he said. "Just shape what comes." Nikitas turned the clay in his hands, feeling its cool weight, its softness. He began slowly, pressing, pinching, folding the form into something round, not a bowl, not quite a cup, just a vessel, perhaps for a single flower or a small handful of herbs. Damon didn't watch too closely. He let the boy find his own way. By the time the stars returned to the sky, the new shape was resting on the shelf, damp and still uncertain, but full of possibility. Damon looked at it with a quiet smile. The future was taking shape, and in the silence of the pottery courtyard, time moved like a wheel, smooth, steady, never hurried. The next morning dawned, gently, with a light mist still clinging to the garden stones. The olive trees shimmered faintly in the dew, and the world seemed to pause in its turning, as if holding its breath. Damon woke early, as always, but today, his movements carried a quiet anticipation. Today was the day to open the kiln. He didn't rush. Instead, he made a cup of warm barley tea and stood in the courtyard sipping slowly, watching the sky shift from pale blue to soft gold. The air was cool on his skin. He listened to the earth breathe. When Nikitas arrived, he was unusually quiet. His gaze went straight to the kiln, and Damon could see the tension in his shoulders. That silent wonder mixed with a hint of worry. Would the vessel survive? Would his dream cup hold together? Damon placed a calming hand on his shoulder. "No matter what we find inside," he said, "the fire has done what it was meant to do." They waited a little longer, letting the sun rise higher and the air warm further. Then Damon picked up the kiln tools, a simple wooden lever and a curved piece of horn used to lift the bricks. Together, they began to unseal the fire chamber, removing the stacked stones one by one, each still warm to the touch. A faint wave of heated air flowed outward, carrying the scent of smoke, clay, and transformation inside. The vessels sat in stillness, no longer soft and fragile, but firm and finished, shaped by earth, fire, and time. Damon reached in first. One by one, he pulled out the larger amphorae, each carefully placed on the padded mats nearby. Their surfaces glowed faintly in the morning light, some with a smooth sheen, others more textured, kissed by the flames in different patterns. Then came the bowl Nikitas had made, with the river stone texture pressed into its sides. Damon held it up carefully and turned it in his hands. "No cracks," he said, smiling. Nikitas leaned in, running his fingers along the fired surface. It felt different now, harder, but still holding the memory of his touch. The texture was still there, subtle yet distinct, like the ghost of the stream where they had first imagined it. Finally, Damon reached for the dream cup. The vessel was small and pale, shaped delicately, But it had survived. The tilt in its rim had not corrected in the fire, but the slight curve gave it a charm, a personality. Nikitas held it in both hands, cradling it with care. "It's not perfect," he said quietly. Damon nodded. "No, but it is yours, and it is whole." They arranged all the vessels on the central work table, a simple line of jars, bowls, and cups, each one whispering its own quiet story. Damon poured water into the dream cup, watching as it held steady. The water sat still. No leaks, no cracks. The vessel was ready. Later that day, they began preparing for market. Not a large gathering, just a small collection of neighbors and traders who came together each month to exchange goods, to speak, to share food and stories. Damon chose only a few pieces to bring, a pair of amphorae, 2 bowls, and a narrow vase with etched ivy round the rim. Nikitas asked to bring the dream cup. "Not to sell," he explained, "but to show." Damon agreed, placing it in a cloth-wrapped basket alongside a few others. As they walked down the narrow path toward the village center, Damon watched Nikitas carry the basket with both hands. His steps were careful but confident, like someone who had begun to understand what it meant to shape not just clay, but time and patience and care. The market was alive with gentle energy. Neighbors greeted them with warm nods and easy smiles. The scent of baked bread and roasted nuts drifted through the air, and children darted between stalls with pomegranates clutched in sticky hands. Damon found a quiet corner beneath a fig tree and laid out a cloth on a flat stone table. He placed each vessel with intention, not as objects to be sold, but as pieces of a story, shaped by seasons, by fire, by thought. A few people came to look. An old man admired the textured bowl, saying it reminded him of river stones he used to skip as a boy. A woman with weathered hands lifted one of the amphorae and nodded, satisfied with its weight. A young mother asked about the vase, wondering if it could hold spring flowers from her daughter's garden. Nikitas stood quietly, watching each interaction. He didn't speak unless spoken to, but when someone asked about the dream cup, he shared its story, the vision, the shape, the fire. He did not try to impress, only to share. By the end of the market, a few pieces had been traded, not for coin, but for bread, oil, and a soft wool scarf Damon thought would make a good wrap in the colder months. That was enough. As they walked home, the basket was lighter, but their hearts were full. That evening, as twilight descended once again, Damon placed a small oil lamp beside the dream cup on the table. The flame reflected in the curved surface, dancing gently. Nikitas stood nearby, holding a flat piece of clay. "I want to make another one," he said. "Not the same, just something new." Damon smiled. "Then tomorrow, we begin again." And so, beneath the soft whisper of wind through fig leaves, the potter and his apprentice sat once more in their quiet space, shaping silence into form, shaping time into vessels, a quiet life, still turning, still enough. Morning returned with a hush, as though the earth itself didn't want to disturb the rhythm Damon and Nikitas had come to know so well. A light fog clung to the tops of the olive trees, making the village feel as if it were floating above the ground, suspended in its own quiet world. The scent of dew on earth was rich and grounding, and in the distance, the low bray of a donkey signaled the slow stir of daily life. Damon began the day in familiar fashion. He washed his hands in a clay basin, the water cool and fresh, then lit a single oil lamp in the courtyard, a quiet offering to the gods of craft and patience. The flame flickered softly, casting golden light across the stone floor, and the drying vessels on the nearby shelves. Nikitas was already there, seated beside a slab of clay. His fingers moved carefully, shaping a small open bowl, this one with scalloped edges, like the petals of a flower. He didn't speak right away, and Damon didn't interrupt. The boy had grown more focused, more confident in his quiet ways. Eventually, Nikitas looked up and asked, "Can clay remember?" Damon smiled at the question. "Not in the way people do, but it remembers pressure, motion, temperature. It remembers your hands." Nikitas nodded, satisfied with the answer. He pressed his thumb gently into the base of the bowl, leaving a small indentation, a subtle mark, just for him. Together, they prepared more clay, kneading and folding, soaking and sifting. Damon explained how different clays behaved in different seasons, how winter's chill made it more brittle, while summer's dryness demanded extra care. He spoke slowly, almost rhythmically, letting the knowledge settle like dust on old pottery. After shaping 3 new vessels, a wide shallow tray, a tall narrow jug, and a lidded container with delicate handles, they left the pieces to dry in the shaded part of the courtyard. As they washed their hands, Nikitas asked, "Did you always want to be a potter?" Damon dried his hands on a cloth and looked toward the distant hills. "No," he said softly. "When I was a child, I thought I would be a shepherd. My family kept goats. I loved walking the hills, listening to the wind, the bells." "What changed?" He smiled. "One winter, a traveler passed through. He carried a single clay bowl. No decoration, just perfect in its shape. He said it came from a village far across the mountains. I held it in my hands, and something inside me shifted. I couldn't explain it. I still can't." Nikitas listened intently. "I gave him a wool scarf for the bowl," Damon said. "It was the first thing I ever traded. I still have it." He walked inside and returned with a small, pale vessel, faded from years of use, but intact. Its curve was simple, elegant. Damon handed it to Nikitas. "I've made hundreds since then, but this one taught me everything." Nikitas turned it over slowly in his hands, as if reading a quiet story written in form instead of words. Later, as the sun reached its peak, they shared a meal of lentil stew, olives, and flatbread sprinkled with herbs. They sat in the shade of the courtyard near the wall where an old grapevine curled upward, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze. Damon spoke little during lunch. His thoughts were turned inward, not troubled, just deep. Nikitas respected the silence, sensing that some days were made for fewer words. After eating, Damon retrieved an old wooden box from the storage room. Inside were tools he hadn't used in years, carved stamps, clay rollers, a thin copper stylus. "I used these when I first began making patterns," he explained, setting them out on the worktable. Nikitas picked up a roller etched with tiny waves. "You made these?" "I did," Damon replied. "Each one was for a different kind of vessel. This one was for water jugs. The waves reminded people of rivers." He let Nikitas try each tool on a piece of scrap clay. The boy's eyes lit up as textures appeared, swirls, dots, lines like feathers. The clay came alive beneath the wooden stamps, like a memory being stirred. In the afternoon, they began decorating one of the larger bowls. Damon showed him how to apply slip, a liquid mixture of clay and water, to paint simple designs. Before firing, Nikitas used the stylus to draw quiet scenes along the rim: a bird, a tree, a hill with stars. "They don't have to be perfect," Damon said. "They only have to be honest." By evening, the vessels were set aside to dry once more. The sky turned soft again, painted with strokes of orange and lavender. A warm breeze moved through the trees, carrying the scent of fig leaves and sun-warmed stone. Damon and Nikitas sat on the courtyard steps as the stars returned, blinking into view one by one. "I think I understand now," Nikitas said softly. "What do you understand?" "How silence can shape things too." Damon looked at him, nodding. "It shapes everything. Clay, time, even us." They sat for a long while without speaking, letting the quiet settle over them like a blanket. The day had been full, not of noise or commotion, but of the kind of peace that lingers when it grew late. Nikitas stood and gathered his things. "Tomorrow?" he asked. Damon smiled. "Tomorrow." And with that, the courtyard emptied again, the tools cleaned, the vessels resting, the fire quiet, all ready for another day of soft creation and gentle memory. Morning came slowly, as if it too had learned the rhythm of the potter's courtyard. The sun rose without haste, stretching gentle light across the stone floor and the shelf of drying vessels. A few birds sang, not in chorus, but one by one, each note floating like a thought unspoken. Damon stood quietly in the center of the space he had shaped over the years: the kiln, the shelves, the water basin worn smooth by time. Everything had a place, a memory, a story. The air smelled faintly of earth and pine ash, a familiar scent that wrapped around him like a soft linen shawl. Nikitas arrived soon after, carrying a small basket of herbs. He had picked them from the hillside above the village, lavender, thyme, and wild chamomile. He placed them beside the workspace without a word, then joined Damon in looking over the new vessels, now fully dried and ready for the next firing. There was no urgency, no rush. The kiln would be lit, yes, but in time. Damon gestured to one of the pieces, the lidded container they had made together. "This one," he said, "feels complete." Nikitas nodded. "I added a pattern of stars under the lid." Damon lifted it gently, inspecting the delicate lines. They were subtle, barely visible, but there. "A hidden constellation for storing dreams," Damon said quietly. They both smiled. After tea and bread, they began arranging the next kiln load, working side by side in a rhythm now familiar and nearly wordless. The vessels were placed carefully inside, each given space to breathe, to change. Nikitas took more of the lead this time, directing placement, checking balance. Damon observed, quietly pleased. When the kiln was lit, they sat under the fig tree, again watching the smoke rise into the pale sky. The fire crackled steadily, like a heartbeat, warm, alive, dependable. Damon leaned back, eyes closed for a moment. "You've learned much." Nikitas was quiet before answering. "Only because you taught slowly. That's the only way anything good is made." They passed the afternoon shaping more clay. Damon began a tall vessel, a large jar with sturdy handles. Nikitas worked on a series of small items, a pinch pot, a narrow vase, and a disc that might become a lid. The work was steady, undemanding. There was time for everything later. As the fire burned low and the courtyard grew golden with evening light, Damon brought out something wrapped in cloth, the old travel bowl, the first one he ever traded for. "I've kept it long enough," he said, holding it out. Nikitas blinked. "But it's yours. It taught me what I needed to know. Now maybe it can teach you something new." Nikitas accepted it with reverence, cradling it in both hands. It wasn't just a bowl. It was history, a quiet witness, a reminder that every beginning starts with a small, simple shape. As twilight deepened, Damon showed Nikitas how to seal a vessel for storage. They filled the newly fired lidded jar with dried herbs, lavender for calm, mint for clarity, and placed the lid gently atop. "It's ready," Damon said, "for whatever comes next." And in that stillness, something unspoken passed. Between them, a quiet acknowledgement of a chapter closing. Not an end, but a fullness, a peace. That night, stars returned to the sky in shimmering clusters. The wind moved through the olive trees with a hush-like breath through reeds. The fire's final warmth drifted into the stones of the courtyard, where it would remain long after the flames had gone. Nikitas said goodnight and made his way home, the old bowl wrapped safely beneath his arm. Damon remained a while longer, listening to the world settle once more into its gentle, ancient rhythm. He poured a final cup of tea and sat on the step, watching the stars. And he whispered softly to the night, "Thank you." Outro soft-spoken call to action. And so, we leave Damon and Nikitas beneath the stars, where silence shapes life as gently as hands shape clay. In the quiet rhythm of their days, we've seen how peace is not something found, but something made, one vessel, one breath, one moment at a time. If this story brought you calm, helped you drift closer to sleep, or simply gave your mind a gentle place to rest, we'd love for you to stay with us. Please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this journey so others can join us in these quiet evenings of the past. Sleep well, dream gently, and remember, the softest stories leave the deepest marks, like fingerprints in clay. Good night.